Welcome again to Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific? I'm Ray Powell, and I'm here with James Caruso, of course. I'm coming to you from Bangkok.
From Bangkok. Well, that's great. I'm still here where it's very early morning in the lovely Northeast United States. And our third guest in yet another time zone. I'll introduce him now. Ambassador Shingo Yamagami was Japan's ambassador to Australia until about a year ago, a career foreign service diplomat with MOFA, distinguished career ambassador to Ethiopia, head of intelligence within MOFA, and just a very effective diplomat. So, sir, welcome. We're honored to have you with us today.
Well, thank you, James. It's so great to be here with you once again. This is 8 o'clock, in Tokyo, and actually, I'm now in Nagano, far away from Tokyo, but great to be with you guys.
All right. Well, that's lovely. Well, we're going to start our first question since we'll not take up too much of your time. And we want to understand, why should we care about Chinese Wolf-Warrior diplomacy? And if you could explain what that is and how it's different from traditional diplomacy, that'd be excellent, especially how they used it in Australia while you were there.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, let me take a bird's eye view of, what has been happening between Japan and China. Back in 1970s, when Japan normalized its diplomatic relationship with PRC, like the United States did, we always talked about Japan-China friendship. That was like a mantra. But those days are long gone. I think I was deputy director of China Desk of the Japanese Foreign Ministry in mid-1990s. At that time, we are still talking about China. But since then, China grew both economically, militarily, and it has completely changed to our great chagrin. Once we thought, we could embrace them into our camp. China could be a democracy, China could be a market economy, but those fantasies are long gone. Now we are facing this overconfident China who is trying to make up for the lost opportunity in the past. They are trying to regain their fame and honor at the expense of their neighbors. So we are entering into a very, very dangerous phase right now. That is why we should care, we should worry about China's Wolf-Warrior diplomacy.
So, Ambassador, I'm still trying to. So, we experienced while we were in government, we experienced these Wolf-Warrior diplomats, and they were always sort of puzzling to us, and we were trying to figure out, first of all, what is Wolf-Warrior diplomacy? How did it come to be? Why do China's warriors act so aggressively when it seems so contrary to what we'd expect out of a diplomat?
I think, there was once a time called, hide and bite. Hide your capabilities and, bide your time. And eventually, the time has come for them to shine. That's their interpretation. After the rise of China, both economically and politically and militarily, and they have become very, very confident about their status in the international community. Look, for a long time, China has been the recipient of massive economic aid from Japan. But those days are gone. China surpassed Japan's economic prowess and as the second largest world economy. And now China is becoming very, very capable in terms of military prowess. So they think now is the time for them to regain their lost esteem at the hands of Western or Japanese imperialism, colonialism in the past. And then, these Wolf-Warrior diplomats, so-called, they are appealing, not to the international community, but to Beijing, to the highest echelon of the Chinese Communist Party, so that they can be promoted. I will give you one example. In the recent week, Chinese ambassador in Tokyo made a big uproar, speaking in public. If Japan should support the independence of Taiwan, Japanese people will be brought into a fire. Can you believe this? This was said by Chinese ambassador to Japan. Japanese public will be brought into flames. That means Japanese public will be attacked by Chinese forces. This is a statement coming from a diplomat who is supposed to work hard for the betterment of bilateral relationship between Tokyo and Beijing, but things are not moving in that direction. This is one good example of Wolf-Warrior diplomacy.
It's interesting you say that, because what is in the press that we read is that because Wolf-Warrior diplomacy has failed in Australia and Southeast Asia, they were backing off and moving back towards more traditional diplomacy. What I hear you saying is that's not the case.
I think, you have to, look at the true, color of what they are trying to do, or what true nature of, what they are up to, I should say. And yes, on the surface, they are engaging in charm offensive, especially towards Australia, because they believe Australia is the weakest link among the Quad membership, including US, Japan, India, and Australia. But from time to time, they show their true color. Remember what happened to Chen Lei, that, freed Australian journalist? She was blocked at the Australian Parliament House, or the sonar incident vis-a-vis Australian Navy. These incidents are just, tip of iceberg. So from time to time, although they are engaging hard in trying to woo Australian audience, but they commit a strategic mistake of showing their true color. So yes, charm offensive go in tandem with, their true nature, Wolf-Warrior diplomacy. So Wolf-Warrior diplomacy is not dead at all. They are just using, choosing the appropriate side, depending on occasions, depending on opponents. That is my interpretation.
And as long as we're talking about this, trying to get a sense, and we always discuss this in the embassy. We would have these discussions about why exactly the Chinese diplomats would come out so aggressively, and the question was always, are they under direct instructions to act like this or to say the things they say, or is this an incentive structure that they believe that this is what will get them ahead in their careers? So, to what extent is it one or the other, you think?
I think it's a combination of both elements. Certainly, I think Xi Jinping is giving certain instructions to his diplomats all over the world. They are supposed to work harder for the achieving Chinese national interest. And speaking China's cases, they are engaging hard in this war of narrative, war of legal means, and so on. At the same time, Chinese diplomats are, after all, they are eager to be promoted. So in order to be promoted, they have to sound nice. They have to look nice in the eyes of the leadership of CCP. And some diplomats are eager to appeal, to these eyes and ears. So I would say it's a combination of the two elements you mentioned.
I want to go back to something you just said about Australia being perceived by China as sort of the weak link in the Quad. Why do you think they think that? Is that accurate? What are they seeing?
James, do you recall, at the time of, Kevin Rudd administration, Foreign Minister of Australia, stated to the Japanese counterpart that Australia does not intend to join the Quad because Australia does not want to provoke China. We vividly recall that conversation coming from the mouth of Australia's foreign minister at that time. And China remembers that. And also in terms of public opinion, in the year 2016, according to the Lowy Institute Public Opinion poll, China was regarded as Australia's best friend in Asia, even surpassing the popularity of, Japan. So I think, in the eyes of, Chinese leadership, Australia could be cajoled, Australia could be wooed, or Australia could be even, coerced. I think that is the interpretation of Chinese leadership of Australia. But in that regard, I tend to agree with the tenet of your statement, James. I think China completely misread Australia.
So, in your opinion, if you find yourself, you're a diplomat in a foreign country, and China's diplomats are behaving in this wolf warrior manner and coming out aggressively against the host country or against Japan, what is the best way to respond to this if you are a diplomat looking at this from the other side?
Well, I have been dealing with, China, for almost, 40 years, during the entire career, in the foreign service. And people often say, let's not engage in megaphone diplomacy. Let us save, their face. Let us talk in private, blah, blah, blah. But I think, when push comes to shove, you have to call a spade a spade. So you have to, if you do not really, are not happy with Chinese policies, measures, if you think they are in violation of international rules or they are against, international norm or, law and order, I think you have to speak out. Otherwise, I think Chinese will take it as, your reticence, acquiescence, silence as a sign of weakness, and it could invite further aggression and coercion. And actually, that is not only my experience, but that is a lesson we have learned throughout our entire dealing, with the Middle Kingdom over so many centuries. You have to take a safe distance, you do not want to, identify yourself, associate yourself with them. You have to take a safe distance, and you have to make full use of market opportunities provided from them. But at the same time, you need to be very, very careful. And I think that's a lesson we learned.
Well, certainly from your time as ambassador in Canberra, you were called the untraditional Japanese ambassador because you were quite direct. You were attacked personally by the Chinese ambassador, and some of the Australian media also came after you. Has your approach been continued by other ambassadors from Japan?
I think there is a probably small number of outspoken ambassadors, even in the Japanese foreign service, and it entirely depends upon personalities and how you think about diplomacy. So you cannot generalize the conduct of many Japanese ambassadors. But that said, my book on the experience of Japanese ambassador in Canberra was made the #1 bestseller book in Japan recently. I think that demonstrates high interest on the part of the Japanese public how we should conduct our diplomacy towards China. I think that is a healthy development, and not many Japanese public are satisfied with what is going on right now. And this is high time for us to reconsider our approach to China.
You brought up your book, so let's talk about your book a little. I have not had a chance to read it, and I'm not sure it's out in English yet. Tell us about your book. What you wrote about? What is in your book, and why did you write it?
Well, actually, I wrote 3 books already, and my first book was a sort of a compilation of my newsletter as Japanese ambassador to Australia, and it has been published in English as well by a publisher in Melbourne. And I was talking about my second book. It is a sort of chronicle of my endeavors as Japanese ambassador in dealing with the issue of China in Canberra. And it has been published in the Japanese language, and I'm exploring the possibility of it, being published in English. But so far, I'm still working on it. And the gist of the book is, how I try to show up Australia, which was facing tremendous, coercion or economic pressure from China because of, Scott Morrison's, this, seeking international inquiry into the origin of COVID or banning, China's Huawei from 5G network. China got so upset and started economic coercion, not only on one specific product, but on so many products like wine, barley, wheat, and coal, and, lobster, you name it. So I thought the role of the Japanese ambassador was to, morally and orally support Australia so that Australia will not make, easy or excessive concessions, because that will harm, the rules-based regional order in the Indo-Pacific. But when I said at the National Press Club speech, Australia is not walking alone, that made the headline in Australian newspapers, but at the same time, that met harsh reaction from the Chinese embassy in Canberra. And what was, interesting, as well as disheartening to me was there are 3 separate occasions I was told by Aussie counterparts or intellectuals to, keep my mouth shut on China, seal my lips on the issue of China. That was an outrageous statement coming from Aussie, some Aussies vis-a-vis Japanese ambassador, because Japanese ambassador is entitled to present Japanese perspectives on China. But at the same time, you can say that is how Australia has been infiltrated, or some Aussies have become sympathetic towards the narratives of China. So this is a kind of experience I have encountered, and I thought it would be worthwhile for me to share my experience with readers, not only in Japan, but also in Australia and many other countries.
Well, I would certainly look forward to reading that book. You talk about helping Australia sort of build up its confidence. How does the Quad, the relationship between Japan, Australia, India, and the United States, fit into that? And how is it different, or is it complementary to the relationship on the military side between Japan and Australia that's growing?
Mm-hmm. I think there are 2, very important pillars to, show up Australia when Australia faced tremendous pressure from Beijing. One pillar was, as you mentioned, James, Quad. This, I think, partnership or strategic dialogue, among US, Japan, Australia, India, certainly, helped Australia to stand up against pressure from China. That's for sure. And the second, important pillar was AUKUS. I think that was, created by the tremendous efforts by, people like Scott Morrison and others in partnership with the United States and UK. And these 2, pillars were indispensable, when Australia was trying to, resist the attempts by China to acquiesce Australia into Chinese coercion. So I think, you are right, Quad helped. But having said that, what worries me afterwards, after I left Canberra, is who is talking about Quad nowadays? Japanese Prime Minister Kishida went to Washington, several weeks ago. He made a speech on Capitol Hill. At that time, he just made a cursory reference to Quad on the same, probably weight, given to trilateral endeavors by U.S., Japan, and the Philippines. So I think it is high time for us to look seriously, at the importance of Quad once again. Now that the election in India is over, and I think, when it comes to the importance of, Quad to U.S., it doesn't matter. I think it transcends political division, I hope. So, whether, you will have a new administration or not, after the November election, I think the importance of Quad, to this region, the Indo-Pacific, does not change, should not change.
Well, Ambassador, we recently had somebody that you will remember very well, Admiral Phil Davidson, who, of course, was Indo-Pacific commander during your time in Canberra. We had him on the podcast and asked him about developments in Asia. And when he talked about the most important and positive development in Asia this century, he did not say AUKUS and he did not say the Quad. He said Japan's new national security policy. I wonder if I could get your reaction to that.
Well, I think I'm one of those who was working hard throughout my career to realize but I should say a sound and normal national security policy for Japan, and for a long time I think we have been too passive, we have been too reticent, and I think if you look at the strategic challenges facing us, Japan is surrounded by three rogue states with nuclear arsenal, i.e. China, Russia, DPRK. I think it's long overdue for Japan to regain its military capabilities, along with upholding important alliance with the United States. So all in all, I'm really happy to see the sound development of Japanese national security strategy. But at the same time, we cannot be complacent, because I think Taiwan contingency can come, anytime, and we do have a number of homeworks, to do.
Yeah. You talk about contingencies. The ultimate contingency is if Donald Trump is reelected, and given his past criticisms of various alliances and how much they spend on their own defense, and the accusation that he is transactional in his diplomacy, what would Japan need to do? Would they become more self-reliant? Would they become more integrated with others in the region? Or a third option?
First of all, the result of the, upcoming U.S. presidential election is completely up to the U.S. voting public. So, whoever, comes to the White House for the next 4 years, Japan, is, ready and willing to, work closely with the new administration. That said, what we have to keep in mind as a geopolitical strategist, how do we look right now? I think in the eyes of Beijing, Moscow, Pyongyang, we must look so weak and meek. I'm talking about the leaders in our camp. So I think, we have to make a solid government, and we have to produce solid policies and measures so that our adversaries should not underestimate our prowess. At the same time, perception matters, and once they start overestimating their prowess and underestimate our capabilities, the deterrence will fail. So I'm increasingly concerned about this perception of us on their part. If you look at the recent rapprochement between Pyongyang and Moscow, they must be, Kim Jong-un and Putin must be rejoicing. So I think we have to make every effort to live up to the current strategic challenges facing us. That's my strong conviction.
Well, so you mentioned before this trilateral arrangement that was recently the summit that happened between the U.S., Japan, and the Philippines. But of course, that was the second of two trilateral summits, the first one between U.S., Japan, and South Korea. Both of those took on quite different flavors based on what was going on between the countries involved and also the external security relationships and contingencies. Which of those two summits do you think was more significant, or do you think either of them was significant?
I think the two of them are really significant, and personally, I'm so pleased to see finally, South Koreans squarely looking at strategic challenges facing them, rather than dwelling on the past history between South Korea and Japan, because there is much more important things at stake right now. And I think I'm really, fascinated to see South Koreans have started their engagement, in the East China Sea and in the South China Sea. That is a very, very significant development. And also, I think it's true of the development on the part of the Philippines. We do recall in the, the previous administration of Manila, they are approaching more closely, towards Beijing rather than towards, Washington, D.C. or Tokyo. But now with, the new, president, if you look at the, this, atmospherics of Trilateral Summit in Washington, D.C., I think, that is a really, reassuring development, for us.
So the pressure from China on the Senkakus seems to be growing in tandem with their pressure on Taiwan and around the South China Sea for the Philippines.
James, as China regards Senkaku as a part of Taiwan. So if they should engage in some kind of, military activities against Taiwan, it would include, their move against the Senkaku. One constraint is they are fully aware of the alliance between the U.S. and Japan. They do not want to involve, both Americans and Japanese in their endeavors to, unify, Taiwan. So, I think in that sort of, serious or sober, mindset, they will try to avoid involving Americans and Japanese, because we have clearly stated that Japan-U.S. security treaty will extend to the Senkaku Islands. That means if China engages in military activities, that will invite not only from Japanese, response, but from U.S. response. So they would be very, very, very careful about that. But there is always this, danger of miscalculation and, overreaching, and that could happen. And we do know from our, historical experience, when China starts to misread the situation, they make a big, big blunder. I'm talking about the experience of Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895. At that time, China completely under-evaluated the military prowess of Japan. China regarded Imperial Japan as a complete, small minnow, upstart, and they thought they could crush Japan. But instead, they are bitterly beaten by, military surging, Japan. So hopefully they won't make another blunder, another, misinterpretation. But who knows? That is why we have to make sure our deterrence would work.
So besides deterrence against an all-out war or a conventional war, some kind of an open conflict, there's also deterrence against what we often call gray zone operations. And increasingly, at least sort of in the area where I spend most of my time down in the South China Sea, China seems very undeterred in its gray zone activity. What does that look like from a Japanese perspective? Is China's gray zone aggression growing, and do you think that it can be deterred?
I think you have a very, very good point, Ray. And from time to time, they have tried, gray zone tactics, against, Senkaku. They have sent hundreds of fishing vessels, it could, join the forces of Coast Guard or even Chinese Navy. So, they have been testing our capabilities to respond to such a situation. And that could take place, at any moment. I mean, surprisingly, almost every day or 365 days of a year, they are sending their Coast Guard ships to the contiguous zones around the Senkaku Islands. And occasionally, they are sending their boats, Coast Guard boats, even into the territorial waters around the Senkaku Islands. This is their constant effort to, regain their foothold. And they are engaging in salami tactics, trying to gain, every inch possible. So we have to prepare for every kind of, gray zone tactics. So I think, realistically, the possibility of their conducting gray zone tactics is much higher. They're engaging in total military offensives.
So, the strongest deterrent we have is the alliance structure. But in addition, there should be, it seems, more effort by the countries of ASEAN to come out strong against Chinese tactics, especially Chinese tactics against fellow ASEAN member, the Philippines. As an experienced diplomat, how do you go about convincing countries like Malaysia and Indonesia and Thailand to take a stronger stance, at least verbally?
Yes, I mean, James, we all have, our, sort of, memories of working hard, to trying to convince our Southeast Asian neighbors. But remember, there is a, sort of, dictum-like, saying coming from Singaporeans that U.S. and, China are two elephants. When two elephants fight, the grass underneath Southeast Asia will get trampled. Even when two elephants make lap, the grass gets trampled. So either way, they are trying to take a safe distance from the so-called two elephants. So how to bring them into, our camp requires, tremendous, probably, impossible efforts. So in that regard, I'm so, delighted to see that finally, Philippines are coming, to our side. Probably China pushed the Philippines too hard. But if you look at, the way they are pushing Indonesians, say, Vietnamese, the same could apply to other members of ASEAN, but they are not moving like the Philippines. So I think this shows the difficulty of, our task ahead. In that regard, I think, in terms of public diplomacy, this idea of the rule of law is very, very important. Whenever Americans, Europeans talk about the virtue of freedom, of democracy, they tend to shy away. I'm talking about Southeast Asians. But when we talk about the rule of law, we may invite different reactions because under the rule of law, every country is treated equally, and we don't allow the regional order in which bullies, trample smaller nations. So when we start to, permeate the concept of the rule of law to smaller nations in Southeast Asia, we may get better reaction. That is why the Japanese government, in the recent past, has been emphasizing the importance of the rule of law in the Indo-Pacific.
Well, it's been fascinating to listen to your perspectives here, and I owe you an exit question. So I'm going to, back in the 1990s, I was stationed down in Okinawa, and I went up with a friend of mine, and together we climbed Mount Fuji. But then later on, as my son got older, and I thought, we were back visiting Japan again, and I thought, you know what, I should climb Mount Fuji with my son. But it's been revealed to me that there's a Japanese proverb, and you can tell me if this is true, that a wise man climbs Mount Fuji, but a fool climbs it a second time. So my exit question to you is, have you climbed Mount Fuji, and how many times?
Well, I think I'm not as brave as you are, Ray. So I have never tried to climb Mount Fuji. That is too high for me. I go for lower mountains because less crowded and much easier. But I think that tells us depending on your capabilities, we can choose mountains of our liking. And that is a kind of choice we need to keep and we need to enjoy both United States and Japan.
Well, all right. So I guess you wisely dodged the obvious comeback, which was to comment on my choice to climb the second time. But we do thank you, Ambassador Shingo Yamagami, for a really wonderful interview. We hope that we'll be able to get you back, and we also hope that we'll see your book out in English soon.
Well, thank you, Ray and James, for having me, and vice versa. I mean, if you have any chance to come to Tokyo, come and visit me at Roppongi, or if you have even opportunity to come to Nagano, where I reside. It just takes 1 hour by a bullet train from Tokyo to Nagano. It's the beauty of Japan, so I'm waiting for you in Nagano as well.
Well, Jim, that was great. That was really good. But of course, you had the experience serving alongside him as chief of mission in Australia. I understand he was a pretty interesting fellow. What was it like serving and sort of having Ambassador Shingo Yamagami as a comrade down there in Canberra?
Well, we only overlapped for a few months, so I don't think he had hit his full stride at that point. But from all my contacts and just reading the press, he was very controversial because he was so blunt and so un-Japanese in his approach. He told it like he thought it was, and he talked to the press all the time. He had this blog where he traveled all over the country and wrote about it, who he met, what he talked about, and he turned it into a book. Again, not a very traditional move for a diplomat of any stripe, much less a Japanese one. And the Chinese ambassador just lambasted him pretty tough, and I think he loved it. He really said, basically, bring it on. But you heard he is a true China hawk. He's been studying China for a long time, and I think we heard his approach, which is we got to be tougher than they are.
Well, I mean, I think there's probably a lot to that because I mean, the fact is that to some degree, China is always sort of looking at abroad and sort of testing their perception of the strength of all of their their potential rivals, and you know, they do read acquiescence, or sometimes they even read just normal diplomacy as weakness. That seems to be, you know, part of the landscape now. And I mean, it's distressing. Obviously, we would wish that it would become, you know, again, that diplomats would act diplomatic, but that in a lot of ways that just doesn't seem to be, for many of them, of value.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. He talked about, and we've heard this before, that there's a mix of the diplomats responding to direct orders from Beijing, and also their understanding that they've got to appear tough in general, whether that's a direct order or just the atmosphere within the foreign ministry. Either way, it's a hell of a way to do business.
Yeah, I mean, it does. I mean, it really does sort of, you know, the really distressing thing, you know, beyond just the diplomatic niceties, is you're wondering whether or not they can sort of get caught into some kind of an escalatory cycle simply because everyone perceives that it's too damaging to your career to back down.
Right. Now, the other really interesting thing he brought up was that Japan feels surrounded by nuclear-armed enemies, and made worse by the recent rapprochement between North Korea and Russia. So they are feeling very vulnerable. The Senkaku Islands are constantly under attack, as he said, through gray zone activities. Where does this leave our alliance and where things go? It's really, and what occurred to me is, at what point does Japan say, we can build a nuclear weapon too, you know?
Yeah, well, that's I think that's always in the back of everyone's mind. And if at some point they begin to doubt whether either the U.S. is committed to the alliance or whether the U.S. alliance is sufficient, then, you know, then we really could be, you know, sort of in that neighborhood. And that's, you know, that is, you know, for a person who grew up in the area of nonproliferation and as a fundamental value, because what you're afraid of is at some point proliferation gets away from you, and all of a sudden every other country has a nuclear weapon, and now you're faced with the sort of that world. In fact, the nuclear nonproliferation regime that's been in place forever has actually been pretty successful overall. I mean, obviously we've had some countries that have broken out, and some who are still breaking out, but overall, for the most part, it's kind of kept in place. But at some point, if it begins to spiral out of control and everyone begins to believe that that's what you have to have, then we're into scary territory.
Yeah, Ray. So if I'm China, Russia, or North Korea, and I really don't want a nuclear-armed Japan or South Korea for that matter. So it's something I would hope they would consider as they proceed on their path. But on a lighter note, Ray, you tell us what story you have for us today.
Well, I'm going to tell you about a Chinese diplomat who was not himself, at least in my experience, not a wolf warrior, but he was an interesting fella. And that was my counterpart down in Canberra. And what made him so interesting to me was, it actually took me a little while to figure this out. So, of course, I was the defense attaché. And we would sit down and we'd have these discussions after something would happen. And, you know, we'd usually meet over coffee at kind of a neutral place that wasn't our place or his place. And, you know, the coffees were very, very polite and very, and he was a serious guy, and he wanted to sort of get into the details of everything. And so, but the disturbing thing for me at first was he kept interrupting me. So I'd be in the middle of a sentence and he would stop me and he would say, wait, I have to tell you something. And okay, well, all right. So, okay, go ahead. They would tell me whatever. Okay. And it wouldn't necessarily be related exactly to what I was just talking about. And so then I'd be done. And then we'd have another, few minutes would go by and he'd say, oh, wait, Ray, I have to tell you something. And it finally occurred to me after a few of these meetings that he had a list. There was a list of things that he had to tell me. And of course, he was going to eventually go back to his office and report that he had told me these things. And so he wanted to make sure that he got in all of the things that he had to tell me so that he could write, honestly in his report that he told me all the things that he had to tell me. So that was educational for me as a defense attaché, to understand that when I met with my Chinese counterpart, that I had to give him room to make sure that he got through his list.
Well, clearly the mistake I made with you, Ray, was never giving you a list.
Yeah. So yeah, I was pretty much a free agent. I was just sort of all over the map. So loose cannon. All right, Jim. Well, this has really been great. It's always good to see you. I'll probably be out here in Asia for a little while, so you may be experiencing me from a different hotel room each time. And hopefully we are able to always find good Wi-Fi service somewhere.
All right, Ray. Good seeing you.
All right, great. And for Jim and Ian, our producer, I'm Ray Powell. Thanks for one more episode of Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with all your friends. Take care.